Welcome to Happy Path Programming. I'm Bruce Eckel.
I'm James Ward. All right. Well, welcome to Happy Path Programming.
Right. This is the first one that we've done since the conference.
Winter Tech Forum
Winter
2025.
Which went really well. New venue.
Awesome.
Everybody loved the new venue. We had a whole bunch of other new people. We had folks from the local university, two students and two professors.
And professor perspectives.
Right. It is. Yeah, it was really... It was great. And so because we're using this new venue, we can actually plan ahead. So mark your calendars for either the first or second week of September for the Summer Tech Forum.
Nice.
And that'll be good because most of the tourism...
Summer Tech Forum Unconference.
Yes, the Summer Tech Forum Unconference. And then probably the first week of March. That's what we're penciled in for.
Okay.
For the Winter Tech Forum next year.
Exciting.
So, yeah.
So my highlight from the week, which was kind of a weird one because I was at the conference Monday and then Tuesday went to DevNexus down in Atlanta, came back Thursday night, and then was back at Winter Tech Forum on Friday.
Yep.
So it was like there at the beginning and there at the end. And what was fun was that on the first day, I was like, let's build some AI agents and let's use MCP and all the like new fun stuff. And so we did a session on that on Monday, and then I go away and I come back Friday and like everyone has built AI agents and done all sorts of different like things. And it was super fun to like, you know, be there at the beginning and then see all the results. But it was a bummer I couldn't be there through the whole process. But a lot of people really got into building agents and agentic
there
things.
There was some mental shifts around AI too. You know, there were some people who were kind of staunchly, I'm not going to do that. And then by the end of the week, they were going, I guess I'll do it. I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I think Will even built something without writing any code. Right. He was like, I'm just going to vibe code this thing.
Right.
Like fully agentic,
I'm not
workflow.
Sure how comfortable I am with that term, but I guess we're stuck with it.
Oh, vibe coding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. It's kind of weird, but yes. And you or somebody was saying, oh, that's what you've been doing the whole time. I'm not sure, because I don't just throw it in without trying it out. I study the code and I ask it, is there a way to do this better, more elegantly? That's what I'm going for. I still want it to be, good book examples.
It's true. We, Okay, well, let's get into it with Justin Reock. So, Justin, welcome back to the podcast. Last time we had you on, which I think was a couple of years ago now, you were at Gradle, and so we talked about developer productivity stuff that you were doing at Gradle. But I ran into you. Did I run into you at DevNexus? Where did I see you? Somewhere recently, and I was like,
so long ago. Yeah, it was DevNexus. Yeah,
DevNexus. Yeah, but I was like, now you've got a new gig, and we've got to touch base with you again to get the latest update on what you're doing. So welcome, Justin. Good to have you. Maybe just give a little intro to where you are and what you do and what you care about.
Sure. Thanks, James. Bruce, always great to hang out with you guys. And I'm Justin Reock. I am now the deputy CTO at DX at getdx.com, which is a software engineering intelligence platform that uses a combination of qualitative or self-reported metrics and data, as well as system metrics to try to paint a picture of developer experience and help organizations understand how to improve that. And then, of course, leading to the knock-on effects of better overall productivity, which I think we all pretty well established at this point. Better developer experience leads to better productivity outcomes. Imagine that. So
I don't know that everybody believes that. I think, on the inside you're going, it's obvious. But I think there's a lot of people who go, it doesn't matter. You make them come into the office. What the heck?
AI will make them more productive.
There you go.
Yeah. So you're in the same vein of like, how do we help developers have a better experience so that they're more productive and maybe enjoy what they're doing more?
That's exactly it. And Avi Noda, who's our founder and CEO, has produced a lot of information on this subject. In fact, he was involved in the publication of the latest DevX set of metrics, which comes from the same body of thought within University of Victoria that produced the Dora metrics and produced space framework. And so he and I have been, working on the same mission for a number of years at this point. But there just hasn't quite been a point at the company where they were ready to have somebody like me who's going to want to go all over the world and talk about this kind of stuff. And but they've had an outstanding couple of years at this point. And so the timing was just right, and so very happy to now kind of be working directly with this company. I do believe that we're solving a very difficult problem, and we've still got a lot to learn industry wide. But I think that our approach with the DX Core 4 and the Developer Experience Index, which I'm happy to kind of dive into, it is the best current possible way to do it.
Nice. So before you were focused on kind of tooling around builds and how do we use build information to give us insights into productivity, but now you've actually are like part of creating kind of the methodology of measuring developer experience. Would that be the right way to say that?
I think that's right. That work is still very, very important, right? Local iteration speed, and being able to trust the development environment, the test frameworks, reducing flaky tests and other sources of toil. But I think what we've learned is that there's just a lot more to it. There are so many variables to this problem, and we have to be able to look and really be able to measure, how quickly are code reviews getting turned around? How hard is it to debug stuff that's running in production? How confident are we in the changes that we're making to the code? How well is the work that we're doing impacting what our customers need from us, right? I mean, all of these things pull together now into, I think, a much bigger picture of how we can really define productivity. The same principles are still there. You can't have developers waiting 20 minutes for a CI/CD pipeline to finish because you're going to context switch, uh, and that's a very toxic workflow to have to keep switching back and forth between work. All of that stuff is still very true. But when we look at the way that DX gathers data for looking at this problem, we can go beyond system metrics. Like we've developed a set of survey questions that are deeply well researched by PhD professors at University of Victoria, and very well validated, that allow us to drive very high and meaningful participation rates, gathering qualitative and self-reported feedback from developers, and cross-reference that to what the systems are telling us. What are the build tools telling us? What's CI telling us, and all of that.
One of the things that worries me anytime one starts coming up with metrics, because we've seen it before many times, where somebody comes up with a metric and then someone in management says, well, as long as you're measuring test coverage, obviously it should be 100%. So make 100%. You start managing to the metric. I think that's the phrase they actually use. And are you able to? The qualitative survey stuff feels like it's going in the right direction, but I don't know. It's like it's not your fault that that's how management is taught. Oh, you can't manage what you can't measure. That's what they say.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then as soon as they do that, oh, now I've got dials and levers I can shift, and problem solved. And they don't understand that this is let's see. There's complicated and complex problems, and the complicated ones are the ones that you can fix with all the dials, and then the complex ones happen when there's humans or weather or something like that. There's all these unpredictabilities, and they go for, oh, we'll treat everything as if it's complicated, and if it's complex, I don't know what to do. We'll just assume it's complicated.
So there are two very important laws in place here that have led us to this problem. You are spot on. Trying to manage to a metric, trying to paint a picture of experience and productivity, looking at a small, limited set of metrics, you're going to run into, first of all, Goodhart's law, which is the law that says that as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? And what that means is that if I'm only looking at things like PR throughput, diffs per engineer, things like that, well, if I'm an engineer and I'm either being punished or incentivized for either missing a metric or hitting a metric, you better believe I'm going to get very creative about the way that I hit that metric.
Yeah.
So if I need to hit, 20 PRs a month or something like that, well, I'm going to be updating the README file quite a bit to make sure that I'm hitting that metric.
Yeah, like we
Um,
saw this with lines of code was when there was
oh,
incentives
yes.
tied to number of lines of code. Cool, I'm going to just write more verbose code
I will
instead of
just
writing.
hit carriage return many more times.
Right.
I'm going to
It's
make long comments, really long comments. Yeah.
no,
No,
it's,
no, all of those things. So we've learned this though, right? So Dora metrics were, I think, the first one to at least start looking at a distillation of a number of things to try to tell a story, a broader story about what's happening in the organization. So if you look at the Dora metric of deployment frequency, for instance, how often is an engineering team capable of making deployments out into production? I think it's fair to say that an engineering team that can only has the capacity because of process and because of release mechanisms and things are able to release maybe once every 2 weeks or once every month. That's going to look much different than the engineering organization that has the process and tooling in place to release 100 times a day. Now, do you need to release 100 times a day? Probably not. But what happens when the next big high profile vulnerability comes along and you're the company that can patch that 5 minutes later versus the one that has to go through a lengthy review process and release process to get that patch out to production, right? And so there are
so in that case,
like,
the kind of metrics or the goal doesn't necessarily become the target that you want to hit, but it reveals something that you may need to change so that you can achieve other things.
yeah, absolutely. And the second law there, before we dive into that further, is one that's not talked about enough. If you go and look at Dora, and if you go look at some of these experience metrics, you'll come across Goodhart's law pretty quickly. A lot of people are talking about it and how to deal with it, and I'm happy to share my opinions on that. But the one that's not talked about enough is Ashby's law, and specifically Ashby's law of requisite variety, which says that for a system to comprehensively and reliably control another system, it must have the same number of variables or more than the system that it's trying to control. In other words, another way of saying that is that trying to get a handle on these very complex problems, as you brought up, Bruce, means that you have to develop a solution that's as complex or more complex than the original system that you're trying to wrangle. And so that is where we end up hitting a wall with this. And then Bruce, to your point, a lot of times people just throw their hands up in the air and say, that's it, it's too hard, we can't do that. We'll just have to look at something simpler. But what we've done in developing our index around developer experience and the way that we've effectively blended Dora metrics, space framework, and DevX metrics into a single framework, we've reduced a lot of that complexity. We've allowed it to be more portable, but we still tell the right story, which is how do multiple metrics interact with one another and stay in tension with one another, and what stories do those tell?
So it sounds to me like, I guess, when I'm hearing what you're trying to solve, there's certainly, okay, you measure, there's some things you can measure, there's some things you can survey, but then there are other techniques like retrospectives where they, to me, that gathers a lot of super good information and things that maybe are actually actionable, but it's not. I guess I'm imagining, okay, what if I was trying to set up a company like you're setting up, and there is okay, here's the stuff we can automate, but then there's also things that are more consulting-ish that, like, hey, retrospectives and somehow, getting people to communicate better. There are various different things that are kind of hands-on, and I don't necessarily know that you can automate. What are you trying to solve here?
No, I think
How?
retrospectives are important. I mean, what's the point of gathering all this data and cross-referencing the data and analyzing this data if there's no audience for that data, or if that data is not built into the decision making of the business? I think it's important to understand when we look at this data, you know, what is the more diagnostic data that we would look at? We would try to look at trends, and we would probably look at those trends on like sort of like a quarterly basis, something like that, versus what is the stuff that we can look at like right now? What can we, kind of pulse on that maybe more of a bit of a leading indicator? But regardless of the category of data, using that data and integrating it with the retrospective. Instead of just saying, oh, I have a gut check that this felt this way, although, I think gut checks actually don't get enough credit. I think humans are actually pretty good at observing things and pretty good at situational awareness. But taking the data that we pull and using that to drive a retrospective can be very effective, right? I mean, I think everybody wants to be data driven, and I think few people understand how to transform to a more data driven culture. But a lot of it really just comes down to making sure, like, hey, if we're going to start tracking some new metric, or if we're going to start looking at some new piece of data, we need to understand who is accountable for that data, who should be upset if that data is inaccurate or is out of date. And so who should drive making sure that we keep accuracy there? And then what part of our workflow and our decision making process does this data help to guide? It's not the end all do all, but it does give us a way to understand trends, a way to understand if we're doing better or worse in some place, and can drive better engineering outcomes.
I guess the other thing that I have encountered, because this still sounds like a consulting sort of operation to me, because you're going in and you're trying to help companies do better jobs, is discovering what the company is capable, what kind of change it's capable of. Usually, I found that the aspirations are dramatically higher than when you go in and you go, okay, you're not, here's some fundamental thing that you're not doing. Like, I guess a surprising number of companies are not using, build automation and version control and stuff like that. And somebody says, oh, we want a better developer experience by doing this and this and this. And then you go, oh, you're not doing something basic here. That's where you need to change, and you're totally not even ready for this other stuff. I don't know, that the ability to change to me is kind of an essential part of whether you're going to have any success or not.
Yeah, engaging what like you said, the willingness to change, because you've got a culture that you're
or ability.
Yeah.
To change.
Yeah, there may be, I don't know, regulatory constraints that don't allow you to do certain things.
Sure.
Yeah. So how do you bring those two together of the desire for making things better, but then the maybe organizational headwinds that you may experience related to that?
Well, so you always need to be able to have, for any type of transformation in business, right? You need to be able to have some sort of top-down pressurization, right? You need to have executives who understand, like, here's what our reality will look like in terms of our business throughput, in terms of the overall satisfaction of our employees, if we're able to tweak these one or two things. But to your point, Bruce, I don't see that a lot of this is really possible. We oftentimes will run these benchmarks and find out that the biggest impact to the team right now will be to improve CI/CD process and figure out a way to get around something that's very basic. And I think the reason, goes into systems thinking, right? I think one big misconception that I think a lot of the industry has right now when we start talking about things like developer experience and ultimately developer productivity is that the mind first goes to trying to correct the individual. But if you're a fan of systems thinking, and if you're a fan of W. Edwards Deming and profound knowledge, you'll know that the productivity outcomes of an organization are 95% related to the systems in which the worker is forced to do their work. Only about 5% really is going to be predictable by the worker themselves, right? And so we sit there and we think about, taking corrective action on our developers or incentivizing them to work harder, but we miss 95% of the problem when we do that. So our approach to developer experience and the way that we think about it is really a systems problem. Like, we're thinking about, what are the systems that these developers are working in? How can we measure their efficacy in terms of allowing engineers to just do their job and to do it well? This isn't new. If you look at Peopleware, the book Peopleware, Tom DeMarco, Timothy Lister, they ran these wonderful experiments from the 80s to the early aughts. And, there's a lot to this. I highly recommend that book. It's still, I think, one of the most important books to understand the foundational concepts of developer experience. But what they found effectively was that when they looked at the productivity capabilities of workers, they did find that there were organizations that were capable of producing at 11 times The highest performing organizations were 11 times as productive as the lowest performing organizations. But what's equally interesting to me is that inside a single organization, there was only about a 20% differential in productivity between workers in the same organization. And if you compare that to the 11x spread, that's statistically insignificant, right? So we need to be focused not on the 10x developer, we need to be focused on the 10x organization. And the 10x organization is defined by frictionless systems as much as possible.
Yeah, because you put a 10x developer into an organization full of friction. Did you read Bob Sutton's book on, I think it's called Friction? Yeah.
No, I haven't checked that one.
Yeah, I
I don't
think
know.
it's one of his most recent ones.
Is that about like organizational friction?
Is exactly what it's about. Yeah, he's at Stanford, and he's always been looking. He's the one that wrote what was it called? I don't know. He's written a bunch of books, but he's more of a definitely organization systems the way they are not working, and here's why. So could be a good resource for you.
I mean, I always go back to, and I will check that out. Thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
This is the stuff I'm super into, and I go back to though the theory of constraints, right? I mean, when we talk about these concepts like friction, bottlenecks, or the opposite of those things like throughput, right? That's fundamental to the physics, the machine physics that introduces, it's introduced in the theory of constraints. That when we look at, how do we want to make our organizations more efficient, we need to look at a value stream map. We need to see how does work and value flow through the organization and become throughput for that organization. And where does it stop? Where does it get gummed up? And then what can we do about that, right? How can we continuously improve that? And you can't really do that effectively when your value stream also includes highly opinionated knowledge workers and very complex platforms and systems without gathering a good amount of data that when you look at the relationships between that data forms a composite of what that organization really looks like, right? And then, you can't go in and expect to fix every bit of it in one sweep, but you can stack rank those problems a little bit. You can say, okay, well, developers are losing a ton of time in this part of the process, or developers are reporting that we're a safe agile organization, and so we have never-ending stand-ups, and we need to get rid of those things, right? Those are the things that can be sussed out when we look at a combination of the right data. And I really, when we look at our developer experience index, the DXI, there are 14 different vectors that we're looking at and applying normalization and linear regression to those metrics to come up with a score that and I can share the math for this one that predicts that for every 1 point that we improve on the scale, we save developers 10 hours a year. So we can do this. It's just really diligence and refining the data that we're looking at.
And when you talk about improving the organization, I don't know. I've gotten a lot of skepticism over the years because look what's happening now. We know we have hard data that shows that people are more productive if they're not in the office 5 days a week. Okay. And yet that somehow challenges the folks who are in power in those organizations, and they're making decisions that are costing the shareholders money. They're not, they're costing the company money, but they're going to do it, and they just make up whatever they want to believe or whatever they want to make up to say, oh yeah, we have to have a return to office. And there's so many of those things. It's like you're running, and maybe what you're doing is like, okay, we're going to give you the data, but I mean, the data's there for return to office, and the CEOs are just ignoring it. I don't know.
I think a lot of those CEOs are playing golf with commercial real estate vendors who are sitting with empty offices.
Yeah, it's not in their interest, not in their personal interest. They're not paying attention to the interest of the organization, of the shareholders, or whatever. Yeah, I just get very. it seems like, okay, there's another problem that we need to solve here. It's kind of like you're looking at the system. Well, maybe it is ultimately, again, a systems problem. But there is this, when we run into this, we go, okay, we can come up with all the data and all the reasons, and then they're motivated by something completely different.
Sounds like you should work somewhere else. I mean, I think that ultimately, there is social Darwinism in play here. And the fact is that a business that is able to achieve a better throughput, get their features out to market faster, hopefully they're lucrative features. If they're not lucrative features, I can't help you there. But if you have a profitable product and you are able to move more quickly to meet your customers' demands, and you're able to, I think most importantly, allocate developer cognitive load to new features and improving the product as opposed to maintenance, keeping the lights on, things like that, you're going to outpace your competitors, right? In the long, those CEOs, their companies will fail, and I think especially now coming into this, new force multiplier with Gen AI and all these other things, we are now going to live in this world where this just can't be ignored anymore. And I look at the landscape, 5 years ago, even. I mean, an eternity in this industry when I was at Gradle, and it was very hard to get executives to care about developer productivity engineering. They didn't see it. I think a lot of them probably have never written code, and so they don't understand the difference between deep focused coding work and constant interruption and how hard it is to be productive. But now to say that if you look left and look right, a lot of people, even at the C-suite and S level within companies, are talking about this. They may not have the correct picture yet, but at least it's seated in their mind. Oh, we got to do something about this developer experience thing. And so that means there's still a lot of work to do. We have to align the industry. We have to spread this type of awareness. We have to let people know that there is a right and a wrong way to think about this. But I think that we're in a better spot with it than we were just a few years ago. And I think that those trends will continue.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I believe you, and I'm glad that your company is doing what it's doing. I think when I set out to, struggle with this problem, I had higher hopes, and I've kind of come to realize, oh, this is an evolutionary process, and well, to your point, companies are going out of business a lot faster than they used to. The lifespan of a company is much shorter now, and that's the kind of thing that makes evolution happen. So,
survival of the fittest.
Well, he never said that. He never actually said that.
Social Darwinism.
That is a something that Darwin didn't actually say that. Yeah, but so, like, yes,
but death
right.
is important to evolution.
It is actually, and ideas moving forward. The old physicists have to die before the new physicists' ideas can take hold. So I think, and that's what's frustrating to me, is that in my mind, evolution isn't happening fast enough. But you're right. The companies that say, oh, everybody has to work in the office, what the cost of that is enormous. Not just the real estate, but also the impact on the people. And they're not going to do as well as companies that form now and go, yeah, we're not going to have an office. We'll get together periodically, and it's all about the positive experience you have. And we have friends who, well, you work that way, Bill works that way, and I think those companies will be more successful. Companies that rely more on AI, good AIs for making management decisions, I think are going to do way better. And yes, eventually it'll work itself out.
We've seen some precedent for this. There's another great book, relatively new, called The NVIDIA Way by Tay Kim, which is all about the history of NVIDIA. And it's an inspirational book, especially I think anybody who is interested in the way that, how can one organization be better than another. They tell the story of, I was around for the Jurassic Park dinosaurs, Silicon Graphics, and they were, kind of leading this space for a long time. And NVIDIA was doing its best to sort of catch up. And through a number of different sort of machinations. Obviously, in the late '90s, NVIDIA just started to overtake Silicon Graphics, and what you had then was a lot of influx of Silicon Graphics ex-employees coming into NVIDIA. And they all expected that, NVIDIA was doing these amazing things, releasing a new chip specification every 6 months, which at the time was like unheard of, and like figuring out how to sell the whole cow, as they put it, with different tiers of processors that could perform at better rates. And so these ex Silicon Valley, Silicon Graphics employees are coming in to NVIDIA and saying there must be some sort of magic IP that we don't know about. They must have some sort of. They get in there and it's like, no, everybody's just working really hard and they're really well aligned. And there's not a lot of friction. There's not a lot of throughput. The organization is built very well from the top down. Jensen Huang understands the work that's being done and how to block and tackle his engineers and making sure that they would succeed. That was it. There was nothing. There was no giant quantum leap in the way that things were being done. It was all about process. It was all about building as much as possible a frictionless organization, getting people aligned and getting people caring about what they're doing.
They just had a totally different system of operating. So while they imagined there was some magical, pixie dust that was in NVIDIA, it turned out, they just operate with a different system.
They don't get in the way of everybody who wants to get their job done.
Yeah, they make it easy for high-performing engineers to perform at high levels. Imagine that. And I mean, it's easy to say that sentence, but then you look at all these bottlenecks that can occur as organizations grow, and in some ways, as leadership gets complacent, right? But I think you'll still never find as hard-working a CEO as somebody like Jensen Huang. So.
Yeah, Hewlett Packard used to be when it was run by the engineers who started it. It was an amazing place. Mm-hmm. And they did all kinds of incredible things, and people would, go off and work someplace else, and then they'd show back up at Hewlett Packard again because it was so much better place to work at. But that relied on having those people in charge of it. And when they died and the normal stuff took over, it just became a mediocre company.
They were pioneers in open source. I mean, some of the earliest to the market with like open source program management office and things like that internally. Totally agree. And then, but see, this is where, kind of going back to the conversation about like studying these organizations and looking at qualitative, quantitative data and trying to paint a picture. We can start, drilling down into, okay, we were doing okay. We were kind of, at least flat or maybe moving up on this metric a little bit. And then all of a sudden it's starting to tank a little bit. Like what's happening there? Like Space Framework was the first metric framework to figure out like Dora's telling us some interesting things, but everybody jumped on the Dora bandwagon. And a lot of people just kind of skipped to the end where it's like, okay, well, let's just collect this stuff. And then it's like, well, okay, we have the data. Now what do we do? And it's like, and so Space came along and said, well, maybe it isn't just about speed and to some degree change failure rate and quality. Maybe what we really are dealing with is a dimension of different types of data, dimensions of different types of data that impact one another. So Space Framework is satisfaction, performance, activity, collaboration, and efficiency. That's what that acronym stands for. And a very just kind of textbooky way to describe a good way to use space is to look at, okay, well, let's run a survey and let's get some good participation in that survey. And let's take a look at developer satisfaction on the whole. And let's take a look at some real tangible things that are making them dissatisfied. And let's see what we can do to correct that. So let's say we do this, we find out that there's some approval gate in the release process or in the commit process that developers have to go through. And they hate that because it causes them to context switch and it messes with their flow and it makes it difficult for them to stay on track. So, well, great, let's get rid of that gate. Oh, look, developers are so much happier. Is that the end of the story? Of course not, right? I mean, what if that impacts performance, right? What if that impacts the quality of the software? What if that gate was actually important, right? And so now we have to be able to see, okay, how does this one metric potentially impact another? And now Space Framework is based on incredible research. Again, Margaret and Peggy Story, one of the leading researchers, also Brian Hook and Thomas from Microsoft. Some of these great thinkers PhD thinkers in University of Victoria came up with space. Space isn't very prescriptive. It's like, hey, if you want to start gathering data, you can categorize it into these metrics and you can build these stories. But we are still missing this point of action.
How does it impact decisions and changing the system?
Well, and the other thing that because you said, oh, well, not, right now, 95% of the impact is all the system. But
That
now
was
I'm
Edwards
thinking,
Deming that said that, not me.
it was Deming's. Okay. So, all right. So now what happens if you improve the system? Then I would say, well, then it changes. And now your place where you can get more benefit will be working with the individuals or something. I don't know. I think ultimately this comes down to the problem of we created management for the industrial age where humans were simply doing typically a repetitive job, and now we're still trying to use those techniques to manage creatives. How do you manage the creative process? It's completely different, but we're still hanging on to the hierarchical command and control system that came about in the mid
Taylorism.
1800s. What's that?
Yeah, Taylorism.
Yeah, and that was like, if you haven't read, what is it? It's called The Management Myth, I think. I don't know.
Yes.
You have read it?
Thanks to John Willis, who pointed me in that direction.
Okay,
I
yes,
have.
right. And he takes,
Yeah.
I mean, he goes through Taylor and just goes, yeah, the guy just made stuff up.
Yeah.
And we're and then the various, when they started coming up with management programs in the universities, well, we'll just use Taylor because he's the only thing out there, and it just this ridiculous. Anyway,
No, listen, I'm right there with you, and just as frustrated that anyone even utters, that there's any utterance of those philosophies still now in 2025 in the way that we build things
and
in
they
a
do.
totally different way. It is a source of frustration and something that's part of the reason that's what gets me up in the morning. That's why I'm out on the road. That's why I'm trying to mind club everybody into this
And
different way of
you're doing
thinking.
something about it. See, I'm just sitting here complaining about it. You're actually doing it, which I
Uh,
like.
you,
Two
you
big
brought me on the
thumbs up.
podcast, so that's something. So
You're trying to make something happen. I really admire that. I'm almost a little jealous because that sounds like a really interesting. I would just get so frustrated though. Oh my gosh.
that frustration, it turns into drive.
Oh yeah.
Um, but I think Deming realized this, right? Even in an age of manufacturing, realized that it wasn't just about like setting a stopwatch and figuring out how long it takes somebody to put a widget together, right? That there's a lot more variation. He was a big fan of quantum physics because he understood that really underlying quantum principles is where a lot of this variation in systems comes from. But he also combines that with psychology and understanding, that part of this value stream is the prefrontal cortex, right? It is the executive functioning. And I think that to kind of answer that question, I hinted at this a little bit before, but when we think of like a value stream map, and we do this with highly creative knowledge workers, which is who we're talking about here when we talk about software engineers, we have to add this whole new dimension to that value stream. Like when you're on the assembly line, you're putting a couple widgets together, you might have opinions about the way that widget should be put together, but those opinions aren't going to be very impactful, right? I mean, there's just not a whole lot. At the end of the day, it's like I still got to stick this thing together and move it down the line. When you are writing software and you have all these other variables that are part of potentially impacting that creativity, that has to be considered as part of the overall value stream, right? We know that when a highly creative, not even a software developer, just anybody involved in any sort of creative or even semi-creative task that they are relatively skilled at, that they can induce a state of flow, right? And that flow state is we're starting to really understand more about this. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Shannon Burns, who's a neuroscientist and part of the work. This was on a podcast not too long ago. And what she does, she literally puts the helmet on software engineers while they're writing code and studies their brain activity and brain patterns, and figured out, what's inducing flow. And we've learned more about flow studying actually improv jazz musicians who can go into a flow state almost immediately when they start playing music. And what we're learning is that as we take long-term skills and storage from the back part of the brain and we move that to the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain so that we can move our muscles and do our things, that shuffling of data from back and forth throws off norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine and all these neurotransmitters that are responsible for inducing that flow state. and it feels good, and we get a lot of work done. And there's been a lot of different ways that this has been described. Cal Newport likes to talk about like deep work, right? And or we talk about focus. When we talk about this at DX and in the DevX framework, we talk about flow, and then we talk about the impediment to flow, which is the context switch, right? Being forced out of the state of flow by either having to work on toil, some shifting our cognitive load to work that's just uninteresting and tedious, or being constantly interrupted, right, and pulled off to some other task. When we do that, we don't throw off norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine. We throw off glutamate, the glutamate toxin in the brain, which is it's a natural process. It's the way that the brain effectively separates the work that you're doing until you rest into almost chapters, almost these sort of chemical chapters as glutamate is released. But as that builds up, we become fatigued, and here's where this really can affect business outcomes. If we're sitting in a state of cognitive fatigue, it can be a little misleading because you can still sort of do basic things. I mean, we've all done that. We've all had a bad day. We didn't sleep well and we drank too much the night before, whatever that is. And we can still basically do what we need to do, but we can't elevate the work. It's really hard to innovate. It's really hard to kind of think outside of what we're doing. And so I see, and maybe this is, I've been in trenches for too long with this, but I see a direct relationship between the innovative capacity globally of our species and the amount of cognitive fatigue that our engineers are experiencing. We live in a world where quality of life is in many, many ways driven by quality of software. So much software is still so fundamentally broken, especially consumer software. And if we can improve flow for engineers and other creative workers too, if we can improve that, then we improve our overall innovative capacity. And I think we do that by eliminating these sources of friction and these sources of context switching and things like that. So, when I think about what is the ideal state for a system that a software engineer is working, I think about a system that encourages flow as often as possible, right? I think if I could sum it all up in one sentence, it's that. Now, there are all these variables that can go into whether we have a system that is conducive or not conducive to that. And that's where we start measuring these metrics and measuring the process and the systems and things to try to get a handle on that. But the goal is to try to build systems that encourage throughput, in a way that is frictionless and that allows developers to stay in this wonderful and very satisfying state of flow.
Love that.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, being in the state of flow is great, and it's where we all want to be. But one of the things I've noticed, I've just done a little experiment with this, and I don't know if there's any or much science behind it, but the whole Pomodoro technique where you
Sure.
every 25 minutes get up, move around, which I think is really good. It's hard. Like the few times I've tried it, I found myself ignoring the timer because I was in flow and I didn't want to break out of it. But I also think that could be a good pattern, to actually consciously say, okay, I'm going to get up, move around, and maybe keep you from over fatiguing yourself. I'm just guessing here. Do you have thoughts about that?
Pomodoro is super interesting. I think where it sort of conflicts a little bit with what we know about context switching is that it takes the brain anywhere from 10 or 15 minutes to recover from a context switch and reestablish flow and focus on a single topic. So it's like, this is where I used to focus on the build stuff so much at Gradle. It was like, well, I would rather you have an hour and a half long build time than a 15-minute build time, because at least in that hour and a half, you can go and context switch, do something for an hour, and then come back to the work versus 15 minutes. That's it. Like you don't have enough time to reestablish flow and focus. So I think that's where Pomodoro is a little interesting. It's like the math doesn't quite work out, I think maybe it comes down to, I'll work for 25 minutes. I will context switch, but maybe I'll do something sort of, I don't know, enjoyable. And then, I'm not pulled off into an entirely different task. I'm
Right.
moving back onto the same
I
task.
wonder how much of the context switches that we're used to talking about are interruptive. Somebody from the outside says, stop what you're doing, do this other thing. Whereas maybe this is stop what you're doing and refresh yourself a little bit. So I wonder if maybe they're maybe it's a little different because of that. I don't know.
No, I think that that's actually a super interesting thing. Now, I'd probably have me. It's going to take up rent in my head for the rest of the weekend. Probably kind of thinking about that because I think there probably is a big difference to work for 25 minutes in a state of flow, then take a nice little walk, and then get back to what you're doing, right? Because it's not just the brain chemistry that leads to satisfaction in the way that we feel about the work. I mean, there's our metabolism. There's prolonged sitting. I mean, all these things that can I'm not getting any younger, and I'm getting weird pains if I sit for too long in one position and things like that. So I think maybe there is something to that. I think that to your point about being interrupted, if I get a phone call and I have to deal with something completely different than what I'm working on, I'm really out of whack, and it's going to take me time, and I'm going to be a little bit more tired after that. But if I can do something that's not necessarily interrupting the work that I'm doing and makes it easy. I mean, how many times have you gone to take a walk and you're still solving the same problem, right? You're just thinking about it in a different space.
Yeah, so it's not necessary. It's changing yourself physically, but you can, and it's taking you away from the keyboard. You're getting a break from that, but then you're still maybe, probably still thinking about it, and you're wanting to come back to it. So maybe maybe it doesn't take as long to get back into the flow since you're not really fully out of it. You're just shifting.
For me, it depends a little bit on how my process is going with what I'm working on, because if I'm like constantly running into challenges, things aren't working as I expect, I'm getting like dealing with Rust borrow checker, whatever, and it's really, I'm getting really frustrated, then probably taking some of those breaks would be really helpful. But then there's other times where I'm in flow state where it's like everything is going really well, and it's like I've got this conduit from the creativity in my brain to the code, and it's just all working. And in that case, it actually, I think, can be distracting to like walk away. But as soon as I like encounter a challenge, then it's like, okay, maybe I need to go for a walk, take a shower, whatever. So it does depend a little bit on.
I don't know if I've ever seen you do something like. Usually, you just kind of bite down into it and go.
But maybe the Pomodoro method
Yes,
would be helpful when I'm in those situations.
Yeah.
But there have been times where it is literally flow conduit of creativity straight into code with no having to struggle.
One of the things that I really liked about about test-driven development, not that I've ever been any good at it, but the idea that you have a test. Okay, so you write a test that doesn't work, and then you walk away because it's a bookmark. You come back and you run your build and you go, oh yeah, that's where I was before. I kind of like that idea because it's sort of a really effective context switch. It's like, okay, I'm storing the state of this in that test, and then and I guess I sort of do that even without the tests. I go, oh yeah, the next thing I need to do is this. Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it, I see these things that really bother me when people are talking about like, let's improve developer experience. And one of them is let's reduce cognitive load for developers. But the thing is, a flow state doesn't happen in a state of low cognitive load. It happens in a state of high cognitive load. What's important is that the cognitive load is interesting, right? That we're spending this mental energy on something that we are really kind of enjoying muddling through. And so I think, like to your point, James, about like, well, for me though, sometimes I just really get into it and I'm like, I don't want to get into it. I think that's good, right? I mean, I think that that's an indicator that you are spending your brain's precious mental energy on something that you really enjoy. And so I think that that's another variable that we have to look at here. Are we building systems where developers get to spend their cognitive load on solving new, challenging, and interesting problems? Or do they have to spend their cognitive load on something that's maybe more menial? And I think I like what you said too, Bruce, about like kind of forming this framework for test-driven development. I've never been good at it either. I want to be good at it. I can't claim to be. But on paper, the idea of being able to say, okay, now I've got these sort of chapters of work that are set up through the tests, and ultimately, I think I have once I've written some more of the code, once I've written enough of the tests, I actually have something that's very flow inducing, to be able to just go and go and go until something goes red. I do think that's a good way of thinking about it. But I think we don't need to focus on reducing cognitive load. That's not what flow is all about. We need to make sure that our cognitive load is spent on things that the brain finds interesting. I think that if you find yourself getting up and leaving the work, you have to really question how interested are you in the work that you're doing.
So here's the thing I think I was sort of trying to get to is that I have noticed that when I get into a flow state and I get that endorphin, the chemical bumps that, oh, I've satisfaction of doing something, I don't want to let it go. And I go too long and I go until I get into the stuck, the frustrated state. And I keep thinking, it would be nice if I stopped somewhere before I got to that,
Mm.
because then I get, I don't, mentally exhausted, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where I'm, yeah,
Try to
and
take it too far with the.
yeah, and I do. It's like, oh, I can't. Oh, I want more. It's like if you're playing a video game. I don't play the video
Mm.
games, but when you're playing that, and you every time you level up, oh, I want more of that. I want more of that, and and then you exhaust yourself. And I'm thinking, wouldn't it be better if we figured out how to stop before that? And then when you come back, you're not your last memory isn't, oh, I was so frustrated with that. Your last memory was, ooh, I had that really. It feels like it could drop you into it faster. I don't know how to do that.
No, I think you're right. I mean, no matter what, all of these states are finite, right? It's not like we have unlimited and I'm not a neuroscientist, but it's not like we have unlimited fuel in the brain to keep creating these neurotransmitters and throwing them out, right? I think that's actually a very apt point. Figure out, okay, we can't. I mean, it would be amazing if we could just be in a constant state of flow all the time, but the brain wasn't really built to do that either, right? I think it's when the work becomes frustration, that's an indicator that we are approaching, I think, a forced context switch. Even when we try to optimize the work into good chapters by reducing the distance between a glutamate flush into the brain, that's still going to happen. The brain is still going to tell you, like, look, dude, it's time to go to sleep. So
Yeah. So I had one question for you about we could optimize developer productivity. How much do you get into? Are we being productive, creating the right thing, the thing that customers need?
Mm.
Like, do you get into that piece, or are you focused on just the system of productivity?
No, we do. We have one of the so the what we call our metric set is called the DX Core 4, and I mentioned before that it's a distillation of parts of Dora, parts of Space, and parts of this DevX framework, which includes feedback loops and flow and context switching and things like that. But our fourth, the four metrics, the Core 4, our speed and our primary metric for looking at that is going to be our diffs per engineer, but there are a subset of secondary metrics there. Our effectiveness, which is our developer experience index, which is this 14-point linear regression scale that we look at. Quality, which is our change fail percentage, and a set of secondary metrics as well. And then impact. So our primary metric in impact is looking at this time allocation. So are we spending time on new features, or are we spending time keeping the lights on or doing other maintenance? But we also have secondary metrics that are looking at things like ROI per engineer, revenue per engineer, right? Are we effectively using this time to do the job of the business? We all love to code, but we are also getting paid. There is a certain amount of, I talk a lot about experience and satisfaction, but of course there's a certain amount of accountability that comes with working for a company and trying to move towards that mission. So our fourth metric of impact is all about, you know time is an abstract resource, so just saving time alone doesn't tell the full story. What are developers doing with that time that's being saved, right? What are they doing with that ability to spend time looking at new features? This is incredibly, is coming out a lot when we look at Gen AI impact, right? Are developers, sending off an agent to go and do, you know, 5 years worth of work in 15 seconds or whatever the claims are right now. But what are they doing with that additional time. And that is part of impact, right? Theory of constraints. Ellie Goldratt was pretty clear, right? The job of a lawnmower is to cut grass, and that's its throughput, and it should do it fast and efficiently. The job of the machinery of a business is to make money, right?
Yeah.
And so when we think about throughput in those terms, we are talking about influx of revenue into the business. So yeah, customer impact and all of those things are rolled up into part of the core four, which is where I think that this really becomes more of a metric set for overall engineering effectiveness.
Yeah. I love your perspective there on the AI stuff, because one of the things I've been wondering about is we've had AI code assistants for almost 2 years now, right? And they're getting, better and better all the time. And yet my daily experience with software doesn't match the alleged increases in productivity. And so it's like, where is that time going? Sure, like AI is making us more productive. Like the apps on my phone haven't gotten 30% better in the last
We're
year.
implementing bad designs faster.
So I really wonder, like,
Stupid at scale.
if this is true that we're more productive, where is that productivity going? Because I don't see it. My car is still as buggy today as it was a year ago. And so, like, I don't know. I love your perspective. Like you've got to look at this holistically and be like, sure, there are productivity gains that we can realize through a variety of different system changes, tools, that sort of thing. But then where does that extra time going to? And is it going to the right thing that has the right business impact?
Yeah, I
So,
also
okay.
want to argue a little bit with your flippant saying, "Oh, well, the job of a business is to make money." It isn't. The job your business has to make money to stay in business, but the job of business is to satisfy customer needs.
That's true. But hopefully that mechanism, and again, it's I can always say, somebody else said this. It was Ellie Goldratt who made that distinction. But I think if you're not satisfied with your customers, you're also that full feedback loop of being able to get
But I
paid for
think
what you're
it's
doing.
so easy for people in the management positions to go, "Oh no, our job is to make money," and it's like, no, money is just an expression of value. Your job is to create value.
I think that is absolutely
Yeah.
fair.
So,
I think looking at the underlying mechanism, it is small bits of paper that come back in that tell us that we're doing a good job,
mhm.
or customers that churn and they don't. But we are trying to make things for people, right? Um, I think the AI point, I want to make sure we kind of address that because this has been a focus of mine for the last, I'd say, couple of months pretty intensely. I'm working on a new report, a research report about companies who actually really are seeing the needle move that have brought in agents or LLMs or code assistants or whatever we're calling them today, and actually seen great gains from these things versus companies who are like, yeah, we brought it in and yeah, nothing's really happening. The quality's still bad, and you're still having all these problems. What I'm really learning is that, surprise, surprise, like any other transformative technology, it takes evangelism, it takes education, it takes advocacy, it takes understanding the best ways to interact with the technology to get the most value out of it, and it takes understanding, which use cases. Like for instance, when I ran this study, I looked at developers who were reporting an hour more savings a week using AI. So they're getting they feel their perception is that they're getting some value out of this. And I asked them to stack rank what they thought the top five most valuable use cases were in terms of their time savings. You know what came out was stack trace analysis was the number one on this list. And not even a code gen activity, but more just, oh my gosh, I've got this crazy,
Understanding why
300,
something's not working.
and listen, my gut, I mean, I was writing code professionally 25 years ago. My gut is you go line. But I have a bit of a metaphor here, going back to video games. We already broke the video games bubble, so I'll say this. So I was a child of the 80s and 90s. I played a lot of Nintendo and those early, I guess they're considered very retro or challenging games now. And when you're playing that game, it's you in the game. And part of the satisfaction is like, I'm going to win this thing. I'm going to do it. I'm going to achieve this thing. Well, I was talking to my son-in-law about just how much I suck at these new games, these big expansive games like Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3 and all these things that I really want to be good at. But they're so big and they're so expansive and they're so sophisticated. And there's so much going on. I just get lost. And so I was telling him, like, I was kind of just bemoaning this. And he's like, well, do you use a guide? I'm like, no, I don't use a guide. That's cheating. You can't use a guide. I grew up with Nintendo. You don't use a guide. That's. But here's the thing: these games are being developed now, knowing that the players are going to have YouTube and Twitch and all these other streams that are going to teach them what to do and guides to help them move. And so, because of that, they build bigger, broader, more sophisticated games. I think that there's an apt metaphor here with AI. My gut instinct, because of where I came from in development, that's cheating. You can't have the bot write the code for you. That's cheating. But if you flip that and you say, well, but what if this thing took away some of the rote learning that I'm so proud of, all these code patterns that I've memorized over the years? And if I didn't have to think about that, what kind of apps could I build? Could I build stuff that's more sophisticated? Could I spend time on things that I've had to deprioritize in the past because there hasn't been enough time? And I'm still trying to work that muscle, but having being able to do this research and kind of talk to these developers that are very optimistic about this technology and have really learned techniques. I'm starting to come around to it. I really am. So
So
this
there's
guide I'm very excited about. Yeah.
so the then maybe the answer to why we haven't necessarily seen the impacts of the AIs yet. Part of the answer may be that we're they're helping us manage the growing complexity in a way that maybe we almost couldn't do without the AI, or would be so stymied by the complexity of the systems that we're building now, that the AI is just helping us almost like keep pace with the growing complexity.
Well, the thing is, we're also using it for this very specific thing. We're making widgets faster, but we're not using it yet to make the decisions about what the widgets should be or what they should look like or whatever. And that's the power, I think, of the tool, is that it helps you make better decisions. And sure, on a lower level, I can say, oh, I don't like the way this code looks. Can you make it look better, make it look more elegant? And it can help me do that faster, but still, I'm just writing a function to do that thing. I'm not deciding what function should I even write here, or what product can I make that will make a much bigger improvement on the world than, I don't know, my music app or whatever. Something that like helps people struggle through their day. That could make a much bigger impact on the world than so many of the things that we're doing now. And this could help us figure that out, figure what it is that we should be doing.
So one of the most powerful practices that we can do now is something called recursive prompting, prompt chaining, depending on who you're talking to. But it's basically the same thing, and it's where I use multiple types of models to have different interactions with the model, and I feed the output of that model into the next interaction. So I could start, for instance, with like, I'm a mobile developer and you're a senior React native. This is my prompt to the LLM. I'm doing this in like ChatGPT 4 or something, just a conversational bot. And I'm saying, let's have a brainstorming session where you ask me one question at a time about the following requirements and come up with a specification. And I got a mobile app, and right now it's on iOS and Android, and I want to migrate it all to React Native, right? You do that first prompt, and the bot will do that one question at a time. Have you thought about this? What are you supposed to look like? Pages? What is this? And then you get to a final set of questions. Then you turn around and feed that entire transcript into a reasoning model and say, okay, now take this narrative that we just had and turn this into a specification that I can hand to a developer. And then you turn around and take that specification, feed it into a code generating bot, and you say, okay, now give me a stepwise set of prompts, generate the prompt for me that I should be putting into the algorithm to do each of these units of work, and then feed that into a code gen model, which then gives you a scaffolding for the code, and then you go to town, actually filling in or doing mid-loop code generation or whatever you want. Now I'm taking what could have been possibly days of planning, requiring someone else on the project, and I've allowed the bot to help me reason through and make decisions about the application. That is awesome. It's a really interesting way of using multiple different types of models in a workflow that's pretty easy to repeat, that can get us further on those points, Bruce, about what should I be doing. So.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, we got to let you drop for, I could talk to you all day, Justin. You're so fun to talk to, and I learned so much from you. So,
Always,
but
James. I
you got a
really
meeting.
enjoy it.
But yeah, have fun at KubeCon, and
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you. That was super fun.
Oh, that was a lot of fun. Thanks to both of you. Always a great time.